On today's Tech Help for Churches, iTunes for podcasting. Hi everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Tech Help for Churches. I, of course, am your host, Paul Allen Clifford. Hey, I've just decided if you want to join the conversation, if you'd like to just make a comment, not necessarily talk back or anything, just something strikes you want to talk about. Maybe it's iTunes for Churches, maybe it's podcasting, maybe it's Twitter, social media, one of those topics that we cover here on the show, then feel free to head over to trinitydigitalmedia.com/contact and you'll find all the information there. So instead of listing it out, I'll just make it really easy for you there. Real quick, it would help me out if you listen to this show on YouTube or if you play it on my website or whatever. If you have iTunes downloaded, and we're going to talk about why I want you to do this here in just a second. If you have it downloaded, if you could just click the subscribe button, just do a search for Tech Help for Churches and or Paul Allen Clifford. Probably Paul Allen Clifford is better. PaulAlanClifford. And just in there, click the subscribe button. Now that I think about it, I ought to put that on the website, so I'll do that as well. But click the subscribe button. You can click unsubscribe as soon as you want. That's fine with me. Go back to watching or listening your normal way. It just helps me rise in the rankings because, well, we'll talk about that in just a second. So, when I wrote Podcasting Church, let me grab a copy. Yeah. When I wrote Podcasting Church, this is actually my proof copy of Podcasting Church. If you're listening to the audio, you can't see this, of course, but you'll notice the production back doesn't look like that because I didn't like the way that looked. Too many words, too. So, I wrote an entire chapter about podcasting. Now, you might be asking what, well, not podcasting, iTunes, sorry. I wrote an entire chapter about iTunes. That's chapter 12. Okay, and the reason I did that is because iTunes is the 400-pound gorilla in the room. Most people get their podcasts through iTunes. I'm sorry, Android people. I know that iTunes doesn't work for you, but this matters to you because if you want to get your church's services or some other show where most people can find it, I know you may not like iTunes, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't download it, submit your feed, delete it, call it good. I'm serious. It's probably 60% of people listen through iTunes. The next closest is 20 some odd percent. So it's really a big deal that you use iTunes. So I use iTunes basically to transcode my files and to edit the ID3 tags, and you can also get a URL from iTunes, so you can put that on your website and people can click that. Now, I just found this out yesterday. In fact, on my run, if you tuned into the pre-show, you heard about, I was listening to The Feed, which is the official Libsyn podcast. Now, if you've been watching for any length of time or listening, you know that Libsyn is one of the two media host providers that I recommend. There is Libsyn and Blueberry, and with no reservation, I can recommend both of those companies. Now, if you have just a very small podcast, Libsyn is clearly your choice because Blueberry's bottom entry-level package is more expensive than Libsyn's, but it's also more powerful than you may need if you're just doing audio once a week for a short amount of time, depending on how you encode it. So it could be that Libsyn is your choice. I just heard they've been a company for 9 years, so they've been doing this a long time, and they know what they're doing. So Rob Walsh, who's one of the people over at Libsyn, said a few things about, for lack of a better term, iTunes SEO. Now, what that means is, when you're online and you're searching in Google, you may find that your church's website does not come up, even though you're typing in things that make perfect sense for it to come up. So, Baptist Church, Nicholasville. You would think that all the Baptist churches in that town would show up, but not necessarily, depending on how well you've done your SEO. Well, likewise, there's kind of an iTunes SEO. And remember earlier when I asked you to go to iTunes and subscribe, and then feel free to unsubscribe afterwards and listen in your normal way? The reason for that is the first thing iTunes looks for is search terms. So if you search for Tech Help Church, I will be in that list. But depending on how many subscribers I have, and that's all time. So people who subscribe and then unsubscribe, that's fine. All-time subscribers, then I move up the list. So those are the two primary factors that you should consider when you're working with iTunes in getting your podcast up there into the rankings. So what I think I would do is on Sunday mornings, I'd put a link on the website, make it nice and easy, maybe make a short URL, a bit.ly tiny URL, something like that, or just a quick link from your church's website. So it's mychurch.com/iTunes. You could just say from the pulpit during announcement time, hey, we've just launched this podcast, and if you have iTunes, if you could just go to, and then give them your name, mychurch.com/iTunes. That will pop up the page where you can click subscribe. Please click subscribe, and once you click subscribe, feel free to unsubscribe, but that will help us be found more easily. So you can probably get a few subscribers that way from your church, depending on how technologically advanced your church is. And by the way, they might surprise you. So what I want you to consider is that, put that over there. What I want you to consider is don't automatically rule out your congregation if your congregation tends to be older. Because nowadays, keep in mind that people over the age of 50 were 20-somethings during the time when computers first started coming around. So there's no reason that a 20-something, a 30-something at that time might not want to pay attention to technology today. They've basically become adults in that time. So someone who was 20 or 30 during that time who is now 50 or 60, you might have ruled them out because they're 50 or 60, but in fact, they could be very technologically advanced. You just don't know because you just don't see them in that light. I have a friend who I knew him as a bass player, so I just thought of him as a musician. Well, it turns out that for a living what he did was tech support at a company that I eventually worked for. He helped me get the job there. And I just didn't see him in that light. So you might not be seeing your congregation in the appropriate light. So absolutely make that announcement. Worst thing that can happen, no one does anything. Best thing that can happen, oh, turns out that our congregation actually is much more technologically advanced, and they're happy to help out with things like this, and you might get some volunteers that can help out with the production of the podcast. So that's one thing that you can do. You can also, so I transcode with iTunes to get my file to the right size. I also edit my ID3 tags in iTunes. There are other ways to do it, of course, and if you're on Windows, there's actually some free software you can get that does that and may even do it a little bit better. Dave Jackson over at the School of Podcasting.com suggests some of that, and I'll see if I can't find a link to what he suggests in lieu of editing ID3 tags in iTunes. Now, the next thing you need to do is you need to submit your podcast to iTunes. So here, I've got iTunes open down here, and if you go to believe it's in the store. So if you go to the iTunes store, which there's a button towards the top of iTunes that should take you there, and you go into, I'm doing this by memory, so I might find that I was totally in the wrong place. The store's being slow. Maybe it's because I'm streaming at the same time and I don't have the best connection. It's fairly reliable, although in the pre-show I lost the feed briefly. Could be because I had the Wi-Fi on. But, okay, so that's not wanting to show up right now. Let me see if I wrote about that. Submitting to the iTunes. In order to submit iTunes, you need to have an iTunes account. It's free, but they may require a credit card or PayPal account. Once you've done that, go to the iTunes store and click on Podcasts. Now you'll need to copy your feed URL. If you do not have a feed, you do not have a podcast. I'm sorry, that's just the definition. So you need to copy your feed URL. If you have Libsyn, they have a feed that I hear is very reliable. If you're using PowerPress, there's a PowerPress feed in WordPress that you can get a hold of, etc. So you need to copy that feed address and go to, in iTunes there's a list of links at the top right called Podcast Quicklinks. One of these choices is Submit a Podcast. Click on that, add the feed URL, follow the on-screen prompts, and in a minute or so you'll be done. They do approve these one at a time, so it might not show up immediately. There's actually someone looking at it to make sure that it is in fact a podcast feed, and it's not how to be a terrorist or kiddie porn 101 or something really offensive. So, by the way, that's their threshold. There's plenty of church tech casts on there. Plenty of churches have podcasts, so chances are you're going to be approved unless you're Westboro Baptist. And then please unsubscribe to my podcast. I don't want to give you information if you're Westboro Baptist. Sorry. Okay, it's finally come up for me. Let's see. That was iTunes 10. Yes. So, Quicklinks. Looks like Quicklinks is still there. Let me click on podcast first and take that over there. And so you should also know that you can, if you find a feed of a podcast that does not have an iTunes iTunes button, or they're not in there. In fact, well, what you can do is you can subscribe to a podcast that isn't in iTunes by pasting their feed. But under podcast Quicklinks, just like iTunes 10, just like it said in the book, on the right-hand side, there's Submit a Podcast. And you click on that. And I'm actually going to do this later on, probably right after the show is over, because I haven't submitted the Eternity Changers podcast, which I've had up for a month or two. So it's probably time to get that submitted to iTunes so that people can find it. And I might also submit, I believe that just by virtue of the fact of how I have this set up on my website, I have a every podcast I make feed. So I think I might just make a Church TechCast feed as well and submit that. So that's the next thing you can do. So Yep. So once you do that, there's a page that comes up, submit podcast to the iTunes directory. You paste podcast feed URL in the podcast feed URL feed and click continue. So it's fairly simple. I think they might have some other information. By the way, if you find a podcast that does not have a feed in iTunes, there's no rule that says it has to be your podcast that you submit. So you could absolutely submit someone else's podcast feed and get them in there if you really enjoy it and you want to get them more downloads. Now, I think I would run that past the person first. Or another thing you can do is if someone is, let's say, I've done this once. Someone was outside the U.S. and at that time they couldn't get their podcast into the iTunes store in the U.S. So they asked, so I did it for them. Now, once you do that, there are ways to claim ownership of a podcast that's in there. So keep that in mind. That's why you don't necessarily want to do this without asking someone. But if the fact that their Linux is holding them back, it's something helpful that you can ask, and if they want you to do it, you can do it for them. So I think that's exactly what I would recommend for you. So another thing you can do in iTunes is you can actually use iTunes as your playback engine for intros and outros and commercials and all that stuff, which is what I'm doing right now. I was using Wirecast, but when I upgraded to Mavericks, which is the latest version of the Apple operating system, it broke Wirecast. Now, I'm sure that they're working on a fix over at the Wirecast, and I think Apple is still working on some tweaks to make Mavericks a little bit better as well. So I think that that's all going to be fixed. But in the meantime, for shows like this that are video, I wanted to at least know how long my intro and outro are in the editing process. So that's why I play them with the microphone up. It's not as good sound. I could actually do some other things to make that better, but since I think this is a temporary situation, that's why I'm doing it this way. So those are just a few of the things that you can do in iTunes. Probably the most important one for just being a podcaster is being in the iTunes directory. Remember, 60 some odd percent of downloads for the average podcaster come from iTunes. So you absolutely want to be there. Think if you had 100 people in a room and 60 some odd of them are going to find out about you from a source, you want that source to know about you. See how that works? So that's very, very, very important. So I think that's it. I had something that popped into my head while I was talking, and I seem to have forgotten it. Let's Ed in the chat room, by the way, during the live recording of this show, which it's on Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. UTC, that's during the standard half of the year, the winter half of the year in North America, or the Northern Hemisphere, it's winter. So during that half of the year, standard time in the U.S. is 4 p.m. UTC. During the summer half of the year, it's daylight savings time. So daylight savings time is 3 p.m. UTC. Very confusing, I know. So you can figure out what time it is locally from there. So Ed asks, know of any providers that get all the iTunes specs in the feed correctly? I think Libsyn is where I would look first. I would also look at PowerPress, the WordPress plugin. Those are the two things that I use. Now, I haven't checked my feed recently, and that's a big no-no. I wouldn't recommend anyone not check their feed from time to time, but I just haven't. So I don't know if that gets everything in there, but he provides a link here that's apple.com/iTunes/podcast/specs.html, which I'm going to go to. And you should know XML, which is the programming language that feeds are written in. It's pretty simple. It's a tag before something, a tag after something, and the name of the tag tends to be pretty intuitive. So name tends to be your name. So that's very important. In fact, I'm going to include a copy of this in there because this is important. Some important information for that. So as I said, Ed, what I would do is I would check first with PowerPress and Libsyn. Those tend to be the good providers. You could try through FeedBurner. They used to be very reliable. There's some concern about them, though. I thought the moment they were bought by Google, they were safe for time and eternity, but then Google has been spring cleaning a lot. So it could be that they are about to go away. People in the podcast community have been under the impression that FeedBurner was going to die at any moment for about 6 months now. So it could be that it is about to die, or it could be that it's such a small little thing that the people that make decisions don't even remember it exists, or something in between. But it doesn't seem to have gotten a lot of updates and improvements, so it might just wither. So those are at least the first 3 places that I would try. There are other ways to do it, so you can consider those other ways as well. And I guess that's about it. So feel free to head over to Amazon, AMZN, or if you're somewhere else that speaks English other than the US, amzn.to/podcast church will take you to my book, Podcasting Church. If you'd like a free electronic copy of it, go to bit.ly/podcastchurchfree, all lowercase in both of those situations. And you can find it there. And we'll go from there. If you have any questions, feel free, trinitydigitalmedia.com/contact, and we'll get that taken care of. I will have this up on YouTube as soon as is possible. I've got to do a couple of longer processes to make that happen. So while I would like it to be up this afternoon, it might be that it's not. So you can go to bit.ly/paultube, PAULTUBE, to find all my videos, and please click subscribe while you're there. That would help me out a bunch, and it'll let you know when the new videos arrive. Okay, until next time, go out and change eternity.